Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode. I would say actually a new series of Stratagems. We are back after about a month break. I really hope you got a chance to listen to the Dubai series. The 3-part episode was fantastic. It really feels like I've been spending a lot of time in the oil industry. I read The Price. It's a fantastic book late last year. It made me realize that, there might be something there, and the Dubai story just seemed to be so fascinating. But of course, as I was researching and preparing the Dubai story, the name of Standard Oil and Rockefeller kept coming up. By the 1950s, when Dubai found oil, Standard Oil was no longer around in the form that we're going to see it in this next 3 episodes. But it is clear that Dubai was living in a Standard Oil world. Standard Oil, of course, was founded by Rockefeller. Rockefeller's name still exists today. If you've been to New York, of course, the Rockefeller building. But the story of Standard Oil is, once again, just fantastic. It has everything you may want. There's a deep religious undertone. We saw a little bit of that with Dubai, but I think in the Standard Oil story, it's even stronger, with Rockefeller being a Baptist, a Protestant. We have this sort of unhinged form of capitalism in the late 1800s. Post-America, after the Civil War, it's just a fascinating period for America in the second half of the 1800s into the 1900s, before World War I, before World War II. So this is really, I think, such an incredible story. So in the next 3 episodes, we're going to dive deeper into who Rockefeller was, what Standard Oil did, the birth of the oil industry in Pennsylvania, of all places, in the mid-1800s, and how the story still resonates today. If you have read or ever heard, for example, the Department of Justice going after Google and Facebook for antitrust legislation, well, that story is born in this time period. With that being said, let's jump right in with part 1. Part 1, the divine ledger. Imagine a man hunched over a desk, meticulously recording every cent he ever spent, every dollar earned. Each number has been carefully inscribed in the ledger, not as a form of mere accounting, but as a proof of discipline, of divine order. God does not tolerate waste, his mother told him. And so, John D. Rockefeller did not waste anything, not money, not energy, not a single moment. This is the foundational philosophy of perhaps one of the greatest corporate empires, and I think empire is actually a fantastic word here, that the world has ever known. A company that was built and molded in the image of its creator. Relentless, discipline, inevitable. John D. Rockefeller was quite a fascinating man. He had a very strict upbringing. He was a Protestant, specifically a Baptist. The Protestant background will become important. We're going to see a little bit about this, idea of a Protestant work ethic and how it sort of intertwined with capitalism and business at this point in time. His father once offered him $5 to read the Bible cover to cover. And of course, he did it. And you can start to see this sort of early linking between God and money. There's no sugarcoating this. Rockefeller was deeply religious. He attended church for his entire life. He was deeply charitable, which we're going to see this play out when he creates the Rockefeller Foundation much later on. He was trained from very early to work and to save. He really saw it as a religious duty to get all he could honorably and to give all he could honorably as well. The Baptists, as one of the strands of the Protestant movement, and we actually saw the Protestant movement, of all places, in the McKinsey episode, when we talked a little bit about the Jesuits and the response of the Catholic Church to the Reformation. That being said, by this point in time, mid-1800s, the Reformation takes place in the early 1500s. The Protestants, of course, are split into many different denominations. You have the Puritans, you have the Calvinists, you have the Baptists, you have the Lutherans, and many other denominations. So the Baptists didn't prohibit the accumulation of wealth, but they did oppose its vain, ostentatious display, which creates a bit of a tension in Rockefeller's life. where he's going to collect incredible wealth, especially for the period in time. Today, if you compare Rockefeller to individuals today who have a lot of wealth, it may not seem that much, but we'll see some comparisons later on of just how much wealth he was earning on an annual basis compared to, let's say, average incomes of the time. But Rockefeller didn't become a person who flaunted his wealth in the same way. In the same period, we're going to see other moguls, as they were called, the Gilded Age moguls like Andrew Carnegie, who are sort of known for flaunting the incredible wealth. He will have, of course, houses and mansions and things like that. But this underlying threat from the Baptists to not be vain, might be the right word, to not just go out and show all the wealth, will be quite present throughout Rockefeller's life. And he really embraced this idea that he was really closer to a Christian soldier who had to reject all temptation and not stray away from the path of God. And this applies to everything. Rockefeller is not going to really enjoy things like the theater or card games until much later on in his life. He's going to have a bit of a weird, reverse, Benjamin Button type life where he has this very strict upbringing all the way to about 50 or 60. And then somehow when he's 60 and he's sort of past all the Standard Oil controversy, and of course he's still very wealthy, he sort of starts to undertake all the things that he was rejected in his maybe first half of his life. He'll, go to the theater and he'll go to parties and he'll go on different dates. His wife by this point will have passed away. So he's going to have this thing. But throughout the story of the Standard Oil, this very strict religious upbringing is such a strong undertone to everything that Standard Oil would do, which is also going to create a great paradox, because we're going to see Standard Oil take actions that, objectively speaking, can be described as immoral. But so Rockefeller's going to try to merge these two worlds while maintaining this very strong connection to the Baptist Church. The church also sort of widened his vision, but sort of limited his social life, for a good part of his life, especially until his wife passes away, and they were married for, I want to say maybe 30, 40, 50 years. They really preferred to spend time with people from the church. So his social life was very limited to people in the church who, again, also believed in this very, very strict conservative way of life. But the church will also provide this widened vision of charity and what it means to give to others. And even before he has money, he's really given a high portion of his wealth, maybe 10, 20%. And of course, when he has even more wealth, he's going to give even more. And this is all born at the church level. Now, his family life was unusual, if we want to say that. His dad, which became notorious later on in his life for being unreliable. He would sort of leave town for 6 months at a time. His dad would make money selling scams, like medicine scams to be specific. This is a time where people would go from town to town. They would claim to have a cure for cancer or a cure for something and whatever it was, in some kind of liquid, some kind of potion. So his dad would do this, come back with money, and then leave again. So he sort of grew up as this sort of miniature adult, where as the eldest son, he took on a lot of the duties that his dad did not have, and he developed this sort of exaggerated sense of responsibility that would be quite evident throughout his life. So even, by the time he was 15, 16, he was already acting sort of as the head of the household. He had this complicated relationship with his dad, where he felt disappointed by everything his dad did. And of course, Rockefeller became the opposite of that, right? He's sort of looking for stability. He's trying to find them wherever he can. And he's actually going to take this into the oil industry, which is this chaotic industry, full of the booms and the busts. But this deep desire for stability is going to be forced upon this industry, and incredibly effective, we have to say. A friend of Rockefeller once said that, quote, "What he said, what he thought, and what he felt came from his mother, but what he did came from his father." So his father loved money. He was okay at business. We can say that, he had good business years and bad business years. And his mother was deeply conservative, deeply religious. So these things are trying to be mixed into this one single person. Now, despite this, even when he was early on, Rockefeller was clearly interested in money. There's a story that one day he was strolling the town with a friend, and he blurted out, quote, someday, sometime when I am a man, I want to be worth $100,000, and I'm going to be too someday. So we start to see this person being molded by the time. This mid 1800s time is a time of what seems like great opportunities. Mark Twain, who was president at the time, and actually his story is intertwined with some of the individuals from the Standard Oil Company. He singled out the California gold rush as sort of the watershed event that sanctified a new money worship and changed the country, which might be a little bit too dramatic, but it can be said that this time felt like, if you were a young person, particularly a young man, if we're being honest, right, women still had to be relegated to household duties. If you were a young man, there were all these opportunities to go make money, to go find gold in California, or to perhaps do something in the railroads, which started to become quite popular. There was, of course, shipping and imports and exports with the rest of the world. We're going to see oil become this huge opportunity where, if you're a one person, perhaps you have a small team, you find oil and you become this oil extractor, or maybe you have oil refinery, which is where Rockefeller will start. So Rockefeller is part of this movement of, hey, you can make it. You can make money. You can be someone. You can be worth a lot of money if only you apply yourself. It's sort of like the early stages of this American dream, and it's quite prevalent, even with the Civil War, which will wreak havoc on the country, but maybe less so on the North than the South. This will just be amplified after the Civil War, when it's like, hey, we went to war, it was crazy, it was terrible. Now it's just time to make money. Like it's go and figure out how to make as much money as possible. By the time Rockefeller will join the workforce, he will become an accountant, a bookkeeper, to be more specific. And bookkeeping was an intriguing choice for Rockefeller. Perhaps it made sense taking into account all the variables that we see. Bookkeeping was a way to bring some rational thinking into a world that seemed to be irrational, or perhaps more chaotic, less certain. And Rockefeller almost had like a mystic faith in numbers, right? Like if you could put things into numbers, you could tame the chaos of the world and make rational decisions. So ledgers become this sacred books that guide decisions and save one from fallible emotion. It also helped gauge performance, expose fraud, uncover hidden efficiencies. And in an imprecise world, they sort of rooted things into some kind of solid empirical reality. From an early age, actually, Rockefeller maintained this ledger, and it's called Ledger A. And he actually maintained this specific red book in a vault, even when he was much older. And in Ledger A, he made notes, all the expenses he incurred, all the income, and he just kept this very detailed accountant of his own personal life. Of course, he applied this to his own business. And he would actually bring out this ledger in Bible classes, even 50 years later. He would become almost tearful and tremble as his, went through the pages. And, he kept it in a safe deposit vault, like some kind of priceless heirloom. So again, this bookkeeping is just a way of Rockefeller to maintain order in his life. Initially, his personal life, he of course becomes a bookkeeper, so he starts to add it or use the concepts in his professional life. And when he starts Standard Oil, then he will use the same concepts there. Ledger A also kind of confirms something. Later on in life, we're going to see Rockefeller give out incredible amounts of money. And some people claim that it was sort of his way to atone for sins, to make up for some of the controversial things that we're going to see in this story, perhaps not in this episode, but definitely in the next couple episodes. But Ledger A confirms that he was actually charitable even from his boyhood. During his first year on the job, when he was a young bookkeeper, he actually donated about 6% of his wages to charity. Some weeks he did even more. And even when he was making, only $1 a day, he was given perhaps 5, 10, or 25 cents to different objects, primarily, his Baptist church and related causes. And he also gave to individuals themselves. So there's records, again, because he recorded everything. There's records of him, giving some 25 cents to a specific man in church or a woman in church. And by the time he was 20, his charitable giving actually had surpassed the 10% mark. So just important to note that the Rockefeller Foundation, which is going to play such a pivotal role, especially in the world of science, was perhaps a way for him to atone for sins, as some critics will go on to say. But it wasn't new. Rockefeller, from a very early age, from the moment he had any kind of money as a young professional, he was already given money out in accordance to that deep religious belief that had been trained in him from his Baptist church. Now, Rockefeller got some business lessons from his dad. This is probably the first source of insights into business. It's intriguing that Rockefeller would go on to portray his father as sort of this paragon of business virtue. And he tried to kind of cover up the shady side of his dad. But there were some things that he did do well. His dad always paid his debts punctually. He believed implicitly in the sacredness of contracts. He would write them up, and Rockefeller kind of followed the same thing. There's not really a lot of record of Rockefeller not paying his debts, not following through on contracts. We're going to see other things, but these were just lessons that went through. And of course, that love of money that his father had clearly was passed on to Rockefeller. Rockefeller didn't seem to love the money for what it could buy. Again, he really wasn't buying things. He wasn't going dancing. He wasn't buying boats and things like that. But he did love the accumulation of money. And then I do think he quite loved the dispersion of such a huge wealth. His complicated relationship with his father also led to a habit of secrecy, a fear of the crowd, and sort of this deep contempt for gossip and loose tongues. And we're going to see Rockefeller become increasingly more reclusive as he gets older, as he has more wealth. This reclusiveness is going to backfire, as it sort of will allow critics to sort of fill in the gaps, so to speak, to say, hey, here's this guy, he lives in this big mansion, you know nothing about him, and he's evil. But Rockefeller just distinctly did not like the public attention. He just didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be out talking to the press. He will actually have a change of heart later on in his life when he seems to become a little bit more relaxed, and he would become one of the first business leaders to actually have a PR person, a concept that's so common today, would eventually make it to Standard Oil and just have someone who's specifically designed to help you deal with the media. But generally, he wasn't the kind of person to be out and talking to the media and giving speeches and giving interviews. Now, just in case you think I'm sort of trying to overstate this, there's a story here that one day Rockefeller's father, his name is Bill, by the way, he used to catch his son, like many dads do. The son jumps from a couch or something, and then the dad catches him. So he would do this all the time. But one day, Rockefeller jumped into the arms of his father, and his father actually dropped his arms, allowing Rockefeller to crash into the floor. And as Rockefeller sort of tried to figure out what happened here, imagine, as a kid, how sort of jarring this experience might be. His father looked at Rockefeller and told him, "Remember, John, never trust anyone completely, not even me." So just to kind of gauge the kind of household and kind of life lessons Rockefeller is receiving from his father, of course, from the actions, right? Seeing his father leave for 6 months at a time. His father's actually going to eventually have a completely second family. This is a time where this was much more doable than perhaps today. But he would leave Rockefeller's mom and find himself a new wife and start a whole new family. And Rockefeller is going to hate this. Actually, in fact, he's going to do everything possible to prevent any of his money to ever reach his father's second wife. And maybe second wife isn't even the right term. His father never actually divorced his mom. So this is sort of called as bigamy, to have two marriages. And of course, Rockefeller's dad lies to the second wife, doesn't tell him about the first family. So there's all these things that Rockefeller just sort of loves and hates from his father, and he's trying to cope with it as time goes on. Another early lesson of business was one day the church announced that a creditor was threatening to foreclose on the church, and they had to raise $2,000 very fast to survive. Rockefeller sort of took instant action. He stood at the exit doors, and he asked everyone who was going out and asking them to pledge specific amounts. He pledged, he urged, almost threatened. And as each person sort of promised some kind of amount, 20 cents, $1, $5, whatever it was, Rockefeller, of course, wrote his name and the amount down in his ledger, and he continued to follow on from every possible subscriber. And the plans were absorbed him, right? And Rockefeller, of course, himself contributed what he could, right? Remember, he's still a very young man. He's still in his early 20s by this point in time. In a matter of months, he was able to raise the $2,000, help raise the $2,000, save the church. And by age 20, he had all of a sudden emerged as sort of the second most important member of his congregation, surpassed really only by the preacher. Now, Rockefeller never lost this fascinating belief that his career, first initially as a bookkeeper, but then definitely under the Standard Oil Corporation, his career was divinely favored and asserted by God, right? He would always say statements like, God gave me my money, or he saw himself as an instrument of God. And the reason why he had so much wealth was because God had favored him. He believed that since God favored him with all this money, it was simply because God knew that Rockefeller would know what to do with that money, or that Rockefeller was perhaps more enlightened or more devoted than other individuals. And of course, this relationship kind of goes back and forth. When Rockefeller actually needed some loans initially to start Standard Oil, one of the factors that allowed him to get those loans when he really had no credit to speak of, remember, right, he's early 20s, he's just been in the workforce for maybe a couple of years, but the factor that actually allowed him to get loans was his relationship with the church. Him being such a prominent member of his church allowed him a friendly reception at banks. And so those initial loans even continued to show that close mesh of Christianity and capitalism in his early career. It's helpful here to talk a little bit about this Protestant work ethic idea that Max Weber put forth. The Protestants had a different relationship to God. If you think of the Catholic Church, and this is going to be a bit of a simplified version, but if you think of the Catholic Church, if you are a Catholic and you go to church, the relationship that you have with God is sort of mediated by the church itself. The Catholic Church, of course, is a very powerful entity. By this point in time, not as powerful, but for most of the 2,000 years leading up to this point, it has been very powerful. So individuals who identify as Catholic have different elements to show their devotion and to also deal with doubts and sins. For example, if you sin as a Catholic, one of the actions you can take is to go to confession. You sit down, you talk to a priest, you talk about what you did, and the priest then helps you absolve from your sins. He might give you some kind of action to do, something to think about. And the priest is able to absolve you because it's been given power by the church, right? The church having this sort of special relationship that's been appointed by God. It's sort of the way the power transfers over, right? It starts at the church, goes to the priest, and then the priest can absolve you during confession. You also have things like baptism and all these different acts of sort of repentance that the Catholic Church has created and allow you to take part of. The Protestants, of all denominations here, doesn't matter what we're looking at, even though they vary slightly, do not have many of these acts. The belief that Luther put forth in the Reformation was that an individual, a Christian individual, doesn't need to have some kind of third-party organization, like the Pope, like the Catholic Church, to mediate your relationship with God. You can have this relationship with God directly yourself by just simply reading the Bible and then engaging in it. So many of the Protestant denominations rejected a lot of these elements. So for Protestants, Baptists, Calvinists, Puritans, and so on, there is no confession because why would you need to confess to a priest? Your relationship with God is direct. You don't need to go through a third party to do this. You have priests, but they don't do confession. There is still an element of repentance in Protestant denominations, but again, it doesn't happen through acts. It actually happens just through faith alone. Protestants actually only kept two sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist, which is the communion. So there were interesting things that developed out of this. The Protestants, especially the Calvinists, then created this belief that a small percentage of believers were sort of self-selected. This was called the elect. They were selected by God, and these were the believers that would have perhaps a favorable life in heaven after death. But how these individuals were selected wasn't completely clear. They were clearly not selected by some kind of third party, so it wasn't, some kind of organization that was saying you have been selected. So for Calvinists, they're starting to develop this idea of a work ethic, where if you want a reassurance that perhaps you're part of this small group of elect, then the reassurance comes from hard work, discipline, worldly success in particular. So being wealthy, being successful at what you do is sort of like this reinforcement that, hey, maybe you have been pre-selected because, you have this world of success, and it kind of feeds upon each other. And this created the work ethic that Max Weber would then put forth in this incredibly influential book. This work ethic then eventually becomes a bit of an intriguing cage. The word Max Weber uses iron cage, where even when people are no longer religious, they don't identify as Protestants or Catholic, they still have this sense of work ethic as a way to reassure, provide validation of who they are and their value to the world. So this is how an individual like Rockefeller, who comes from the Baptist, right, one of the Protestant denominations, is able to really embrace economic activity in such a wholeheartedly way. One more point here to know is that in the Catholic world, the way you might actually show your devotion, besides many of those acts we talked about, right, like confession and so on, may actually be by just becoming a monk. And this is why you have so many more monasteries under the Catholic religion, where if you want to be truly devoted, go beyond the average, then you become a monk and you remove yourself from the world and you simply, study religious texts or pray all day. But for the Protestants, it's completely opposite. I say, hey, that makes no sense, because the way to sort of prove that you have been self-selected, that you have a favorable response from God, is actually by taking some kind of actions in the real world, like working hard, like starting a business and something else. Some people have argued that this is one of the differences you see between, let's say, Catholic-dominated countries and Protestant-dominated countries, like the U.S., like Britain, compared to Spain, and sort of the countries that Spain colonized in Latin America. This might be a bit of a stretch, but again, this is just a quick overview about what this Protestant work ethic is. The bottom line that we have to remember here is that for Rockefeller, acquiring wealth, becoming dominant in business, was completely aligned with his deep religious belief. In fact, it was required of him. For you to be a devoted Baptist, to be a member high standing in your denomination, you need to have some kind of worldly success. And Rockefeller is going to look for that in Standard Oil and use that. So there is no conflict here. There's no tension between his religion and Standard Oil. They're really all intertwined and being driven forward by the same ideas. Now, Rockefeller had, again, peculiar arrangements with his father. By the time he was 15, this is even before he was fully in the workforce, he was actually already lending money to his dad at an interest rate. He simply charged whatever sort of the traffic will bear. A practice that actually his father would applaud enthusiastically. And actually his father would do the same thing. There will be moments in time where Rockefeller would need money, especially during the tough early days of business. And his father would say, yeah, no worries, I'll give you the $10,000, but it's 10% interest. So this is sort of the relationship they're having between father and son. In 1855, Rockefeller would go on to look for his first job. He was 16 at the time. He would leave his house at 8 o'clock, clothed in a dark suit, and then make his rounds to different firms. And he was just this grimly determination that he did 6 days a week for 6 consecutive weeks until late in the afternoon. And when he exhausted his list, he simply just started over from the top and visited several firms 2 or 3 times. And again, Rockefeller was just simply not someone who would be limited by rejection. He just took it on and say, you know what, I'm going to go find a job. I'm going to be self-sufficient. I need that because, my father is not completely reliable. And he would eventually find a job and start his first day on September 26th. And for the rest of his life, he actually considers September 26th this special day. He would call it Job Day. And he celebrated this day actually with more gusto than his own birthday. One can even say that perhaps his real life began on that day, that he was sort of born again in this business world and found a way to be his own man in this new world. Work clearly enchanted him. It liberated him. It supplied him with this sort of new identity. And he just loved work from the very first day when he started. Now, he's going to do a few things before he actually goes into the oil industry. He would take on a job, with sort of import, export of grains and a few other things. We're not actually going to cover that too much detail. In 1863, he will go into the oil business. He will enter the business as a refinery in Cleveland, Ohio, where he resides. But before we do that, let's talk briefly about the oil industry at this time and the first product that was released on which Rockefeller built Standard Oil. Part 2. The Wild Frontier. The air is thick with the acrid stench of burning crude. Wells erupt from the ground, spilling black gold onto the dirt roads of Pennsylvania. Money changes hands faster than men can count it. Refiners rise and fall in a single night. Oil is no longer a myth. It is real, abundant, and for the first time in history, an industry. But it is wild, untamed, inefficient. And to Rockefeller, that is unacceptable. The period after the Civil War was really one of the most fertile times in American history for schemers and dreamers, fast-talking hucksters, charlatans, and swindlers. There was a mania for patents and inventions that swept America. It was a time for outsized dreams. For many people in the North, the high drama of preserving the Union, the fight against slavery had really exhausted the capacity for altruism. And they just really wanted to make money. Between 1863 and 1873 was really one in which it was easy to grow rich. There was a steady increase in the value of property and commodities. There was an active market all the time. One really had only to buy anything and wait and then to sell at a profit. Sometimes, as in real estate, for instance, at a very large profit in a very short time. The government was giving out farms through the Homestead Act. And of course, individuals like Rockefeller were becoming part of this industrial towns that were being connected by the railroads. The triumph of the North in the Civil War meant the ascendancy of urbanization, immigration, industrial capitalism, and wage labor over what was primarily an agrarian Southern economy, which was actually doomed to stagnate for many decades. The South had a hard time transitioning to keep up with the North. The war sort of accelerated the timetable of economic development, promoting the growth of factories and mills and railroads. It stimulated technological innovation, and it really ushered in a more regimented economy. Oil was found in Pennsylvania. It is mostly luck that it happened in Pennsylvania. Now we know, of course, that oil exists all over the world. It has been found in other parts in the world before this. We have records, in Egypt and certain parts of Europe. But the Pennsylvania find is notable because it's going to create an industry out of oil. Before this, oil was used, primarily in home remedies. There really wasn't an industry to speak about. So this sort of small patch of Pennsylvania is going to become hugely important for the first little while of oil. Eventually, we're going to see oil in Texas and Ohio. But Pennsylvania is going to get credit for the initial boom, and it's going to be the center of the oil world for the first part of our story. There's a lady called Ida Tarbell. She's going to become hugely important to our story later on, as she will be one of the key people that will help bring Standard Oil down. And she grew up in the oil regions. Her dad was in the oil business. He would make barrels initially for oil. Eventually, he would be in refining oil as well. And she speculated that this little corner of Pennsylvania absorbed a larger portion of men, probably than any other spot in the United States. After the war, of course, there were lieutenants and captains and majors, even generals, who were scattered all over the oil fields. Oil, after the war, was, of course, king now. It was the new cotton in the world of commerce. And soon, Rockefeller is going to reign as the undisputed king in his world. This era is also defined as the Gilded Age in some parts. And the Gilded Age is really a corrupt time period, especially in government. We're going to see handouts and buyouts happen left and right to government officials. The federal government is not going to be as powerful during this point in time. Local government is still highly corrupt. So this is the world in which sort of Rockefeller and oil is being created. And we got to keep this in mind as we're going to see legislation and actions from the government is being shaped by this corruption and heavily intertwined relationship with business. Now, Rockefeller's trips to the oil regions must have strengthened his belief that he stood, in some kind of godforsaken place. There was just so much going on in these places, right? I mean, wherever oil was found, this sort of shanty towns would be created overnight, attracting all kinds of people, right? You have drugs and alcohol. Something they mentioned before, actually, Rockefeller and his wife were deeply against alcohol for his entire life. I actually don't know if he ever even tasted alcohol. So going into the oil regions of this shanty towns that were created must have been just shocking to Rockefeller. All the things that he despised that were not in alignment with his religious belief were out in the open in these oil towns. And he just wanted to run a business. He wanted to run a business that was successful, that was profitable. And how could he when he has to deal with all these individuals? And I think this, what we could describe almost as contempt for the other people that are also working in the oil regions, in the oil industry as a whole. I think it's going to be an undercurrent as we see Rockefeller do deals and go after competitors, where he's coming through in some kind of higher plane that's been divinely appointed, and he has to sort of deal with those individuals who don't really have the same religious background that he does, and they're not as favored by God as he is. Now, at this point in time, there was something called the rule of capture, which meant that people could drill diagonally and siphon off a neighbor's oil, add into the haze to pump. So if someone found oil, their incentive was, of course, to drill as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and even go in that diagonal line into whatever the neighbor's piece might be. So the oil industry is prone to these booms and busts. Oil is discovered. Over the next few weeks, people find out about it. Everyone sort of moves over to this area, and because of the railroads, you can do this relatively quickly. Within a few days, you can go from New York to Pennsylvania. You sort of figure out how to drill for oil, find the equipment, drill down, you get it out, then you transport it. Transportation at this point in time is still quite rudimentary. You try to sell it, and of course, the price of oil goes down. So booms and busts are the name of the game for the oil industry in the first few years. Interesting enough, if you heard the Dubai episode, then you know this is actually just a very common feature of the oil industry. And when the Middle Eastern countries found oil in the 1900s, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and so on, they also learned this lesson the hard way. When all of a sudden they found oil and there was, hey, let's drill as much as possible, because the more we drill, the more money we make. But the more we drill, the more the price drops and everyone loses. So it took a few of these booms and this bust before the Middle Eastern countries realized that, hey, we need someone, maybe an organization that's going to function as a cartel and is going to control production, how much oil is actually drilled from the ground and refined and so on. And it's going to control prices, how much we sell it for. And of course, we're going to see the rise of OPEC take in that role and assign quotas to all the OPEC members. OPEC is still around today. So Rockefeller is seeing the same thing. It's obvious. Everyone sees it. So he's going to have to implement the same idea. He's going to have to implement some form of cartel that's going to control production and is going to control prices to help deal with these booms and this bust. And again, from Rockefeller's perspective, perhaps to deal with the weakness of the individuals who are just simply trying to make as much money as possible instead of thinking over the long term. And really, Rockefeller's long-term view might have been one of his superpowers. The fact that he was able to say, hey, what does this look like over the next 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and how do I put myself in the position to succeed, compared to someone who's simply saying, hey, how do I drill all this oil in the next 4 weeks and then I'm gone? Rockefeller realized that the point where he could actually exert maximum leverage to the industry was actually refining. When oil gets extracted from the ground, it needs to be refined in some way. Perhaps it needs to be separated, converted into different products. Products like gasoline, actually at this point in time, are considered waste products. Remember, there's no cars yet, so there's actually no need for gasoline or fuel. The main product is actually going to be kerosene. We're going to see that in a second. So the refining process kind of converts the raw oil into the output of the product that will be sold. And this is where Rockefeller is going to make his first stance becoming one of the first refineries in Cleveland and eventually the largest. Now, just to show you the crazy fluctuations here in price, in one single year, the price of oil went from 10 cents a barrel to $10, and it fluctuated between $4 and $12 in the next year. So you can imagine that if you're selling your barrel at $10 and all of a sudden in 2 months the price has dropped to 10 cents, this is going to cause issues from the practicality of being able to run the business. So let's look at this first product, kerosene. Kerosene is actually still around. It's a form of fuel, but it doesn't have the same importance that it did back in time. To understand why kerosene became so big, we sort of have to think of the world, just society as a whole, before the mid 1800s. If you were to look at the cities and towns, let's say for most of human history, they would appear nearly as dark as the oak forest around it. You might see glints of light that perhaps would leak through doorways and shattered windows early in the evening, maybe a few lanterns, right, that would have bobbed down the lanes. But there's no street lights. Whatever light you have is coming from candles, and the lamps themselves are shining really just as bright as they did during Roman times, nearly 1,500 years ago. It would have been just enough to lit a bowl of food or a book, or perhaps a shirt sleeve that you're sort of mending. If someone reached for a thread or let out a long sigh, the flame would quiver, and the shadows would quiver around it too. The light was really precious and used sparingly. For most of the night, once it became dark, people would just simply lay in their houses. After dousing their cooking fires, they would sleep and dream away the hours. If by chance you had a moonless night, you'd be able to sort of see all the stars in the sky. It's intriguing to think about this. We live it with so much light today, not just daylight, but just artificial light, that it is estimated today that you actually have to drive somewhere maybe about 150 kilometers before you can actually see what a truly dark world looks like, before you're so far away from any kind of light that the sky even looks different, that is not being affected by the artificial light around you. So our world is so completely different. But before this, there was really no viable source of light once the sun went down. In Europe during the Middle Ages, the close of day was unmistakably announced with the changing and the groaning of bells. Now, bells were always ringing, from cathedral towers and so on, to announce different things, maybe invasions or fires or thunderstorms, maybe the celebration of a marriage, the arrival of royalty, of course. But once dusk came, the bells rang yet again. And this is when the candles and torches of churches were lit. But for many people, the day ended. They went back home and they started to relax. Effectively, their productive days, and I mean the productive in the sense of you're going to do anything like reading or hanging out, it's over. You're going to go to sleep. And you might sleep for, 14, 16 hours until the sun rises yet again. So for many years, the urbanization and industrialization process that we're seeing, especially with the Industrial Revolution, was really searching for some kind of illuminant that would be able to extend the day into night and be able to break this timeless rhythm of rural hours that still govern the lives of farmers and the city folk alike. In 1849, a Canadian geologist named Abraham Gessner developed a way to extract what he called kerosene from a mineral pitch. And eventually, oil refiners realized they could actually take the same process and use it to create kerosene from petroleum. And this process will become viable after 1859, which is when oil was first discovered in Pennsylvania. So kerosene is going to become this incredibly popular way to power lamps into the night. There were other fuel types that were used before kerosene. Whale oil is actually quite popular during this time. But whale oil was, as you can imagine, a difficult type of product to get. You had to go out and hunt the whales and kill the whales. And the whale populations actually were declining during this time just because there was so much overhunting of the whales. So the fact that you had kerosene that was coming from this seemingly abundant source of petroleum in Pennsylvania seemed quite ideal. And kerosene is going to become this major export for the United States, for the refiners, including Rockefeller, just because it's such a viable way to power lamps all over the world, right? This is a global problem that everyone has, and everyone's looking for some kind of fuel they can use for their lamps. It's also helpful to notice that this diffusion of oil-related products, kerosene being the first one, but eventually, of course, we're going to see gasoline, we're going to see diesel fuel, we're going to see fuel oil. It's really a qualitative shift in energy consumption that humanity goes through in this period of time. Coal was the dominant fuel source at the time. The Industrial Revolution, of course, is sort of marked by all these coal power factories. We're going to see coal all the way into the First World War, when even British ships are still using coal, and they're sort of having this huge debate as to whether they should switch their ships and submarines into using oil from petroleum. But this petroleum refined products, they were really superior to coal in every respect. They had a higher heat content, that is, they release more energy per unit mass when burned. They were easier and safer to produce. They were cleaner, which may seem unusual, right? In the world today where we think of oil as so dirty and this sort of huge problem with fossil fuels. But if one thinks that oil is a dirty fuel, then of course one has not seen coal burning. And coal actually replaced wood that was used before as a way to sort of provide energy. And if one thinks coal is dirty, then again, one has not seen wood burning at a mass scale. So these petroleum refined products are cleaner than coal. They were more convenient to burn, and they were just simply a little bit more easier to transport even. We're going to see all these developments, right? Like the shipping containers, even railroad tracks that can move the oil from one place to another. And despite some issues we're going to see with pipelines and things like that, generally speaking, the oil is easier to transport than coal. It's going to be a much more viable source of energy for a growing world. It's not the U.S. Not only the U.S. that's urbanizing, so many parts of the world is doing it at the same time, and oil is going to become this critical fuel to make this urbanization possible. Now, kerosene again will also take religious undertones with Rockefeller. He would go on to see kerosene as a god from gift. In fact, even petroleum itself would actually be seen as a gift from God, where you have this product that's in the ground that's been formed over millions of years and now is becoming abundant. It kind of has like religious links, if you can think about that. But kerosene is going to have the same thing with Rockefeller, where he'll see that kerosene has been given to humanity by God, and it's a way to sort of light up the world when sun goes away. So again, Rockefeller's always seen the industries through this rose-tinted spiritual lens, and it just provides him the motivation to work harder and to do more. Now, Rockefeller's refinery is going to be objectively good or objectively superior to other refineries. His ceaseless search for even minor improvements would allow his refinery to overtake his non-oil business. Of course, Rockefeller would see this and he would go all into oil refinery. He would eventually develop a refinery process that was just simply more efficient than competitors. And he was able to sell the refined products at a lower price than competitors and still make a profit. By the time he's 25, he's going to gain complete control of his refinery business. Before he had some business partners, he would eventually buy them out and take complete control, which meant he would make all the decisions. And by this point in time, when he's 25, his refinery could treat 500 barrels of crude oil daily, twice the capacity of its nearest local rival, and really ranked as actually one of the world's largest facilities. This world, of course, was marked by waste. A common story you hear from this time is the refiners didn't know what to do with gasoline, so they actually would just dump it into rivers or the soil. Rockefeller was trying to figure out what to do as much as possible. He didn't quite know what to do with gasoline as well. So it's not quite clear what he was doing with the extra waste, but eventually gasoline will become important. Other byproducts will become important. We're going to see Standard Oil develop things like Vaseline, which will eventually get spun out and sold to Unilever. So Rockefeller, this idea of wasting, which is crazy. How can you use every single thing that you have? How can you take every product and find a way to sell it or to reuse it, to make it more efficient, to optimize? That was his entire mindset during these early days. And it led to a high level of efficiency, right? That rational bookkeeping mindset meant that he was running a highly profitable, highly efficient business in a world that wasn't quite known for that, right? It was a world that you can make quick money, and it didn't really matter if you were efficient or not, especially if you're not going to be in this world for more than 6 months, for more than a year. You're not going to see the ups and downs. You might be able to just get in, get out before everything collapses. Now, by 1866, fully 2/3 of the Cleveland kerosene that was refined, again, primarily by Rockefeller's refinery, was actually flowing overseas, most of it routed through New York, which became the export entreport for oil. Rockefeller understood the value of having cash, and he really knew how to work with bank creditors. We know that one of his first loans was given primarily on his relationship with his local church. Of course, by the time he's 25, he is running a highly successful refinery business in Cleveland, but he's still always looking for more money. That was perhaps one of his secrets, that when he went at acquiring his competitors or expanding, he always had a lot of cash, often more cash than anyone else. And he seemed to have this great relationship with bankers. There's a story here where he was walking down the street and he was trying to figure out how to urgently get a $15,000 loan when a local banker pulled up and asked Rockefeller, "Hey, do you think you could use $50,000, Mr. Rockefeller?" Rockefeller, of course, trying not to seem too eager and perhaps taking some lessons from his father, he said, "Well, maybe give me 24 hours to think it over." And by stalling, Rockefeller believed that he was able to pin down a more favorable deal, which I think ended up being true. So whether there were downturns or difficult times, Rockefeller always had cash. And the stories of how he gets cash are incredible. He might go to New York on the railroad, talk to all the local bankers, and come back with $100,000 to be able to continue his expansion. So not only is he running a highly efficient business, highly profitable, and always looking for ways to make it more profitable, he is also stacking sort of this war chest that's going to help him deal with the downturns, which of course are going to come. At this point in time, Rockefeller doesn't have enough control of the industry to deal with the downturns. And of course, to be able to use the money during opportunities that may be profitable, especially when taken on a long-term view. Now, oil is not the only industry that suffers from overproduction. The salt industry actually suffers from the same thing. And there was a salt cartel that developed shortly around this time to be able to prop up the salt prices and, again, control production. This is actually going to provide a bit of a precedent for Standard Oil, which is what we're going to see next. But at this point in time, the oil region is still chaotic. It's unstable. People are becoming rich overnight and also becoming broke overnight. The opportunities will disappear, but the patient, the disciplined, well, those individuals, they will endure. And Rockefeller is nothing if not patient. So it is time for him to go from just being the largest Cleveland refinery to perhaps something a little bit more. It's perhaps time for him to take control of this chaotic oil industry. And that is all for the first episode. My name is Ruben Garta. In the next episode, the second out of 3, we're going to see how Rockefeller is going to take control of this chaotic, rowdy industry. He's going to make a covenant with refiners and anyone else who's going to join him. And of course, those who don't are going to suffer the consequences. The next episode will be live in a week, so look out in your email or your podcast app for that. Until next time, we'll talk soon.